Hey guys, today we are going to review George Washington's presidency, and before we get into the actual events, I would like to go ahead and review some vocabulary. So one of the vocab words that we learned with George Washington was that as the first president, he actually set several precedents. And so a precedent is an example. Some precedents that he set was serving only 2 terms as president. He also set the precedent of giving the State of Union address in front of the Congress every single year. And then we also learned he set the precedent of giving a farewell address as he left office. The next vocab word that we learned was impressment. And this word is actually going to come back to us in a few weeks when we study some future presidents. Impressment is not a good thing. It means to kidnap somebody and force them to join your military. At this time during Washington's presidency, the British were impressing American sailors and forcing them to join the British Navy. All right, the next one that we learned is actually a phrase, and we learned the phrase necessary and proper. Now this is going to come into play when we talk about our 2 political parties during the era. Basically, Federalists believed in a loose interpretation of the Constitution, and they felt that it was possible to make laws as long as they were necessary and proper for our country. And what is considered necessary and proper by the Federalists during this time period was the creation of the National Bank by Alexander Hamilton. Okay, we also talked about staying neutral. Neutral means that you are not going to pick anybody's side, you're going to completely stay out of it. And then finally, vocab-wise, today we also talked about tariffs. And you guys knew this one already, but a tariff is going to be a tax on imported goods. So if I buy something from another country, my American government is going to make me pay an extra tax, and that tax goes to my American government to help pay off the national debt. All right, so my big things that I need to know about George Washington. Well, while all this craziness is going on over in Europe, we have Britain and France fighting, and then we also have France going through their French Revolution and getting rid of their king and queen. Washington proclaimed neutrality. He forces all Americans to stay neutral, stay out of it. We're upset, though, about the British impressing our sailors, and so therefore Britain stopped impressing U.S. sailors and left the United States because of Washington's treaty that he writes called Jay's Treaty. Now, sometimes they will ask you about how George Washington interacted with the Native Americans. George Washington did not create compromises. He sent troops to defeat natives and to expand west. So he was not very willing to let the natives stay where they were or to continue fighting against the Americans, and decided to just go ahead and send in the troops. Next up, we have the Judiciary Act. And at the time, Supreme Court judges were having to get on their horses or get in buggies and travel all around the United States listening to court cases over and over and over again. So with the Judiciary Act, we're going to let the Supreme Court stay in one place. We're going to create lower federal courts, but these federal courts will all be supreme to state courts. So whatever decision is made by a federal court, states are going to have to uphold. Yesterday, we discussed the domestic event of the Whiskey Rebellion, and we said that taxes are created by the federal government in order to create money or revenue, and we're going to be using that money in this time period to pay off our national debt. While the farmers were angry about this and they decide to start revolting, George Washington is not happy about this. He says, look, you guys elected representatives to be your voice in this national government, and this is what we have decided to create. Now you have to follow this federal law. So Washington gets on his horse and he brings over 13,000 troops with him to try to put down the rebellion. Well, before he even gets there, the people find out that George is on his way with 13,000 troops, so they get a little bit nervous and decide to go on home. The importance of the Whiskey Rebellion is that it showed the strength of the federal government. I'm sorry, this is going out of focus. Okay, so Whiskey Rebellion, you have to know this effect. Showed the strength of the federal government. This is going to be the opposite of Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion showed that it was weak and that we needed to replace the AOC with the Constitution. But Whiskey Rebellion finally proves that the federal government is strong. All right, we have 2 more topics to cover. First off, Hamilton's financial plan. Alexander Hamilton served on George Washington's cabinet as the Secretary of the Treasury, and he had the big problem of how we're going to get rid of America's debt after the American Revolution. Okay? Well, one thing that he wants to do is create a national bank, which again we said he believed was necessary and proper. It is never mentioned in the Constitution, but as a Federalist, he believes in a loose interpretation of the Constitution. So he creates this national bank to be necessary and proper, and he's going to have a national bank with one currency that is used by all of the states. He, of course, issues the tax on whiskey, which leads to the Whiskey Rebellion. He then enacts tariffs. He creates tariffs on imported goods. This is going to encourage people to buy more American-made products so the money stays in America instead of people spending money on foreign items like British tea. Finally, the compromise of Hamilton's financial plan and the way that he gets Southerners to agree to accepting his plan is if we move the national capital to Washington, D.C., which is technically in the South. It is smack dab in the middle of the 13 original states, so this makes everybody happy. The final topic that you need to be well versed on about George Washington is his final precedent, his farewell address. So now, because George Washington gave a farewell address to the people of America as he's leaving the office after serving 2 terms, every president gives an address, and it's basically giving their advice to the nation for the future. Number 1, he says, do not create political parties. And number 2, he says, stay neutral. Do not form any permanent alliances. You don't want to get caught up in other countries' problems. All right, that's it for George. We're going to pick up with John Adams later next week.